My name is Tariq Mahmood. I'm the Vice Chair of the Havering Interfaith Forum, and this week it is World Interfaith Harmony Week. Thank you for attending and welcome to our interfaith discussion on how my faith came to Britain. And today we are in the premises of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and there will be different perspectives from 5 speakers. Then we will have a break and have a little snap before we listen to the rest of the remaining speakers. We will then end with an interactive question and answer session. So we'll introduce our first speaker, Linda Kane, from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. And you can see from the map here that we've got a map of North America, and the story of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints starts in upstate New York in Palmyra from 1820, and you can see here that there are routes along there. If you see the red line there, you can see that there's a route travelled along here where the Latter-day Saints set up different places to live to escape persecution, and they were inspired by God to know where to stop each time they set up gatherings. So they were aiming, once they got around this area, they were given guidance to go to the west, and they started the westward trek to the Salt Lake Valley. It was uninhabited at that time, so it's a very long trek, and so that's where our story starts. Now, obviously, we're going to come, how did we get to Britain, to the UK? Now, this was in the early 19th century, and it's in the mid-19th century that the early pioneers moved across America. And the first missionaries to arrive in England, in Great Britain itself, was Heber, Kinroy and Orson Hyde, and that was in 1837. They arrived at Liverpool docks, and within 8 months, hundreds of people had joined the church, and missionaries continued to arrive from that point onwards. And here we have a little illustration of Heber C. Kinroy and Joseph Fielding, another missionary, in England, being greeted by those who had joined the church as a result of their missionary labours. And so let's have a look at our British map now. Missionaries arrived, as we've seen, 1837 in England, 1839 in Scotland, and 1840 in Ireland and in Wales. So that gives us a kind of a brief synopsis of where we are. Now, most of the action when the first missionaries arrived in Liverpool docks down here, and at first, most of the proselyting happened around this area, around the Preston area. And at one time, the headquarters of the church in Britain was actually based in Manchester. And then it moved to London, and then it went to kind of around the Birmingham, Solihull area. Okay, so every missionary that comes over these days is usually self-supporting. And they do it on a voluntary basis, so they save up their money to come over and do missionary work, either service missionaries or proselyting missionary work, or family history missionary. There's humanitarian, there's different types of missionaries, that's a different talk. And one of our future presidents and prophets of the church, Gordon B. Hinckley, when he was a young man, lived in a flat on this street in Preston. So that's just a bit of historical context really to get that into context there. They always live in modest accommodation because obviously the church can't afford to pay out lavishly for people. Okay, so this is the River of Ribble in Preston, Lancashire. And the first baptism in Britain took place here from the Restored Church of Jesus Christ on the 30th of July 1837. And there was actually a race there was quite a group of people getting baptised at the same time, and there was a race to be who could be the first person baptised into the church in England. They were so excited. And there's also an Oriental Gardens in this large Preston park. It's very large, it's a beautiful park. We've visited it a couple of times now. And they've got a memorial up talking all about the first Latter-day Saint missionaries that came to Preston. And so it's lovely to see that. And see it's set in the Oriental Gardens because it's a very quiet, tranquil place. And Dan Jones was preaching in Wales at this time, and you can see here he was a very good speaker, apparently, a very powerful voice, and he actually visited Joseph Smith in Carthage jail the day before the prophet Joseph Smith was killed by law. And during that visit, Joseph Smith told Dan Jones that he would serve as a missionary in Wales. And Dan Jones was a Welshman, and during Dan Jones's 4 years in Wales, more than 3,000 converts were baptised, so it was very successful. In January 1845, he joined the church, so he returned to Wales then as a missionary. So he wasn't the first missionary from Wales in the church, but he was a little later, 5 years later. And he wrote several church publications. And in 1846, the Welsh hymn book became the first non-English Latter-day Saint hymn. So it was the first church hymn book was actually a Welsh one. I thought that was quite interesting for you as well. And not many people know or realise that the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, as it used to be known, it's now known as the choir on Temple Square, was actually formed mainly by members from Wales because they're such beautiful singing voices. Okay, so between 1840 and 1920, more than 50,000 British converts answered the call to gather in North America. So a lot of people that joined the church, thousands of people joined the church over here in that time. But they were asked to travel to America to build up the church there because they were gathering in the Salt Lake Valley, and they wanted to have a safe place to live and gather to Zion. And okay, so this is interesting as well. On one of the boats, or the ships I should say, that the Latter-day Saints were leaving to America on, at London Dock in 1863, Charles Dickens was aboard. And he said the name of the boat was the Amazon. And he said, "I had come aboard this immigrant ship to see what 800 Latter-day Saints were like," he wrote. "Indeed, I think it would be difficult to find 800 people together anywhere else and find so much beauty and so much strength and capacity for work among them." Fully expecting to bear testimony against the Latter-day Saints, Charles Dickens changed his opinions after observing the passengers. "To my great astonishment," he said, "they did not deserve it." So in Dickens' book, The Uncommercial Traveller, he describes the scene he beheld with wonder. Nobody is in an ill temper. Nobody is the worse for drink. Nobody swears an oath or uses a coarse word. Nobody appears depressed. Nobody is weeping and down upon the deck. In every corner where it is possible to find a few spare feet to kneel, crouch or lying, people in every unsuitable attitude for writing are writing letters. Obviously they post those once they've got to shore back home. Okay, so once the British Latter-day Saints had disembarked from the boat, which could be anywhere along this coast, depends upon which passage they were taking. They would join the saints along their trek. Some boats went around, so they would go all the way round to disembark at San Francisco, which was a much longer journey. I'm not quite sure why they would do that, to be honest. It's probably the only passage available, perhaps it's a bit cheaper or something. And but anyway, the 50,000 British converts that gathered to North America had to make the trek the same way as everybody else. They had to do it in weather of all kinds. Sometimes it was extremely hot, as you can imagine, going across that area. Sometimes extremely cold. They were crossing the Rocky Mountains, so it's very difficult to traverse, and people did lose their lives because of it. However, every pioneer that sacrificed to join and bolster the saints in the Salt Lake Valley never regretted it. Lots of them kept diaries, and their families have preserved these, and they've been printed, and we've been able to read about how they thought it was worth the sacrifice. They never lost their faith as they went forward into the unknown. So various modes of transport were available to take some provisions and a few belongings. You can see some wagons here crossing a river. Quite often people would just walk holding bags or something if they couldn't afford to buy a wagon, which was relatively expensive if you'd already used quite a bit of your money to buy passage across the ocean. So a lot of people had these hand carts where they had to pull them, or they'd turn them around other times and push them. And children would help, and they would walk along with a little mile reader so that they could tell how many miles they were going and things like that. And often they travelled together so that they were in safety in numbers. So here's just a little thing here. Soon after the first Latter-day Saint pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, Brigham Young asked the Welsh convert John Parry, famous for his wonderful singing voice, to form a choir which originally consisted of 85 Welsh converts. And today the Tabernacle Choir, as it was known previously, and now it's known as the choir at Temple Square, has 360 members plus an orchestra and organists. So this is the Englishman John Parry. This is what it looked like. Now I think this was probably in the 1920s this photograph was taken, because obviously they didn't have photographs when they were going across. And this was in the Tabernacle. And this is in the New Conference Centre. So they don't sing for big audiences in the Tabernacle anymore, so that's why it's usually called the choir at Temple Square or the Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square. So we've talked a little bit about the Welsh. Okay, so a London temple was completed and dedicated in 1958. It's called the London Temple, but it's actually in Surrey. I think it's because most people recognise old London. If you said the Surrey Temple to people, they probably wouldn't recognise where that was. That are out of this country. So it's called the London Temple. And it's a beautiful grounds, very lovely. And that's a nice sunny day here. We've got a snowy one. It's usually lit up at night. It just looks so beautiful. Preston Temple here. Bird's eye view here for a change. This was completed and dedicated in 1998. Again, a lovely temple. And beautiful surroundings there too. And at night again, it's lit up there. Birmingham Temple was announced it's going to be built in April 2022. That was announced last year. So it's in the planning stages at the moment. And the third British pageant is being held in August this year in Preston, Chorley. And I don't know how clearly you can see that, but it's kind of like a reenactment of what it was like to gather on board a ship and to be able to tell your conversion story as you were were sailing and gathering converts to go across. So it's a real historical theatre piece. And that's the end of my slides. So that's it in a little nutshell.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk, a lot of new stuff for me, and grateful for that. Our second speaker is John Lester. He's our Bahai representative and chair of the Havering Interfaith Forum. So I'd like to welcome John Lester. Thank you.
Bahai Faith began in 1844 when the herald of Baha'u'llah, the Bab, declared his mission and gathered lots of followers. A lot of persecution followed, and the Babis, as they were called, came under a lot of pressure. They were attacked and had to defend themselves from the army of the Shah and so on. Eventually the Bab was executed in Tabriz in what turned out to be sensational circumstances. When the firing squad commander came, he was talking to his amanuensis. And when he was taken away, he said, "Until I finish all I have to say, no power on earth can stop me." The commander, Sam Khan, who had an Armenian Christian regiment, took him through the streets. And as they walked through the streets, people were jeering and saying, "Show us a miracle." And Sam Khan, being a Christian, became extremely uneasy because there were overtones of Calvary about this. That is what they showed Christ. He said to the Bab, "I've got nothing against you, I don't want to do this." And the Bab said, "You must do your duty, and if you're sincere, rely upon God to remove your perplexity." So the firing squad fired. When the dust settled, there were a heap of ropes on the floor. The firing squad had simply shot away the barbs with ropes. He was found, he was talking to his amanuensis and said, "I finished now you may proceed." Sam Khan marched his troops away, another regiment came in, and they succeeded. What has this got to do with Britain? Well, this happened on the 9th of July, 1850. On the 22nd of July, 1850, this letter was written. Camp near Tehran, July 22nd, 1850, to the Right Honourable the Viscount Palmerston, my Lord. It begins with a talk about the persecution of the Babis by the army. There's been an intermission in the context of the endgame between Shah's troops and the Babis of that city. And then, but more importantly, I suppose, it then goes on to say, the founder of this sect has been executed at Tabriz. He was killed by a body of musketry, and his death was on the point of giving his religion a lustre which would have largely increased its proselytes. The smoke and the dust cleared away after the body. He was not to be seen, and populace proclaimed that he had ascended to the skies. The bulls had broken the ropes by which he was bound. He was dragged from the recess where, after some search, he was discovered and shot. His death, according to the belief of his disciples, will make no difference, as Bible still exist. And then he goes on about more persecutions and finishes up. There have lately been several severe earthquakes in Khorasan, which have inflicted severe damage and destroyed a large number of people. Finishes up. Your Lordship, I have the honour to be, in truth, the greatest respect, my Lord, your Lordship's most obedient, humble servant, Justin Shield. Justin Shield was the British resident in Tehran. He was getting all his information from the court of the Shah, which, despite everything, acknowledged that there were two firing squads. Letter then came to England, and so there was a mention of the Baha'i faith in England in that letter. In 1867, Baha'u'llah wrote to the rulers of the world, telling them to come together and unite. He wrote to Queen Victoria, who fared rather better than most. He said, for example, "We've been informed that thou hast forbidden trading in slaves, both men and women. This verily is what God hath enjoined in this wondrous revelation. God hath truly destined a reward for thee because of this." Later on he said, "We've also heard that thou hast entrusted the reins of counsel into the hands of the representatives of the people. Thou indeed hast done well, for thereby the foundations of the edifice of their affairs will be strengthened. The hearts of all that are beneath thy shadow, whether high or low, will be tranquilized." He says, however, "It behoveth them, however, to be trustworthy among his servants, and to regard themselves as the representatives of all that dwell on earth." So a letter from Baha'u'llah came to England. There was a man called Wilfred Scawen Blunt who did a lot to publicise Islam in Victorian times. He wrote a book called Secret History of the English Occupation of Egypt. And during it, he talks about how he met in an tent a follower of the Bath. And he speaks very favourably of what he found. This book was published in England sometime in the 1870s or 1880s. So again, there's a mention of the Baha'i faith in England. Then, most significantly, there was a Cambridge professor, Edward Granville Brown. Edward Granville Brown investigated the Baha'i faith, went through to Akka and met Baha'u'llah. And this is his account. In the corner where the divan met the wall sat a wondrous and venerable figure, crowned with a felt headdress of the kind called Taj by dervishes, of unusual height and make, round the base of which was wound a small white turban. Face on him whom I gaze, I can never forget, though I cannot describe it. Those piercing eyes seem to read one's very soul. Power and authority sat on that ample brow, whilst the deep lines of the forehead and face implied an age which the jet black hair and beard flowing down indistinguishable luxuriance, almost to the waist, seemed to be lying. No need to ask in whose presence I stood as I bound myself for one who was the object of a devotion and love which kings might envy, and emperors sigh for in vain. A mild, dignified voice bade me be seated, and then continued, "Praise be to God that thou hast attained. Thou hast come to see for a prisoner and an exile. We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations. Yet they deem us a stirrer up of strife and sedition, worthy of bondage and banishment. That all nations should become one in faith and all men as brothers, that the bonds of affection and unity between the sons of men should be strengthened. That diversity of religions should cease and differences of race be annulled. What harm is there in this? Yet so it shall be. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come. Do not you in Europe need this also? Is this not that which Christ foretold? Yet do we see your kings and rulers lavishing their treasures more freely on means for the destruction of the human race than on that which will conduce to the happiness of mankind. These strifes and this bloodshed and discord must cease, and all men be as one kindred and one family. Let not a man glory in this, that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind." That account he used as an introduction to a book called The Traveller's Narrative, published in 1891, the meeting was in 1890, which was published in Britain, and thus talks about the Baha'i faith. In 1893, in America, there was a World Parliament of Faiths, and one of the reverends there mentioned the Baha'i faith at that meeting. Very soon afterwards, people started to join the Baha'i faith in America. One of them, a lady called, was a lady called Phoebe Hurst decided she'd go on a big pilgrimage to Haifa to see Abdul Baha. And she knew a lady called Mary Thornton Crocker. Mary Thornton Crocker decided she would go with Phoebe Hurst on a pilgrimage to see Abdul Baha. Mary Thornton Crocker, though, lived in London. She was an American living in London. She saw Abdul Baha, the eldest son of Baha'u'llah, appointed successor. She became a Baha'i and returned to England as the first Baha'i. She soon met a friend called Ethel Rosenberg, who was English by birth, and Ethel Rosenberg joined the Baha'i faith as well. Ethel Rosenberg was the first British-born Baha'i. In 1901, a lady called Mary Bowles had been sent by Abdul Baha to Paris, but she wanted to leave. And she said, "Can I leave?" And Abdul Baha went, "No, you must stay there." And she stayed there. And eventually she discovered, she came across a man who she thought looked seemingly pure. She told him, she spoke generally about religion. The next day when she saw him, he said he had a strange experience about a kind of blown wind around him and a cry of "Christ is come." She told him about the Baha'i faith and he became a believer. His name was Thomas Breakwell. He was the first English man to become a Baha'i, although this was in Paris. He went to see Abdul Baha and came back. He was worried about the fact he had a job in America. He was on vacation in Paris. I did a cotton mill and they used child labour. So he probably cabled his resignation from that. 1902 though, he died, and there's a long tribute from Abdul Baha to that. 19th century also had an account by Lord Curzon, who wrote about Persia and the Persian question in 1892 and mentioned the Baha'i faith very positively in that. In 1907, a lady called Lady Blomfield became a Baha'i. She was the first Baha'i of Irish birth. And she also was very active. She actually sent an invitation to Abdul Baha to come to London and to stay at her home. In 1911 he came and stayed with her, and many people came to visit them. He went to the city temple and gave a talk. He gave talks at many other places. Religious people and religious priests invited him to their places. And then, this was 1911, he went to the United States and spent almost a year in the United States, different places, and back to England. And one of the places he visited and spoke at while he was here was the mosque in Woking in early 1913. Lots of connections with the Baha'i faith in England. One was that letter to Queen Victoria finished with a prayer for Queen Victoria, and it said that she would ask that she could help his faith in her lands. At the end of the First World War, 1918, there were plans to execute Abdul Baha in Haifa, but the British intelligence got wind of this, and there were a lot of people there who very much liked him. And Allenby was told to march quickly on Haifa, and he did it so quickly that the defenders couldn't do what they wanted to. Abdul Baha was safe. So that prayer of Queen Victoria was actually a prophecy. And in 1943, the British held the Nazis back at El Alamein, and the Guardian of the Faith, Shoghi Effendi, was on a Nazi hit list, and had they got through to Haifa, things would have gone bad with him. Shoghi Effendi, as I say, was the great-grandson of Abdul Baha and became the guardian of the Baha'i faith. And he had a close connection with England because he was sent to Oxford in 1920 to fulfill his education. 1921, Abdul Baha died, Shoghi Effendi became guardian. In 1957, Shoghi Effendi died in England, because Baha'is must be buried within 1 hour's journey of the time where they live, 1 hour's journey, not 1 hour, of course. He's buried in the North London Cemetery in Southgate. So now we have some Baha'is here, and where you have Baha'is, you have an administration. So Baha'is, where there are more than 9 Baha'is, you have what's called a spiritual assembly, future house adjustments. You have to elect those from all the Baha'is in your particular area. There's no nominations and no candidates. Everyone votes and can be voted for. The first local spiritual assemblies were set up in 1923 in London, Manchester and Bournemouth. And the first national spiritual assembly, that's the national body, of course, that was set up in 1923. It's the National Assembly of England in 1923 and the National Assembly of the British Isles in 1930. It's now the National Assembly of the United Kingdom because there's a separate National Assembly of Ireland. The Publishing Trust was set up in 1937. 1963, the centenary of Baha'u'llah's declaration was held at the Albert Hall in London. So that is how Baha'i faith came to England. It's interesting that the accounts of Abdul Baha papers were sent all around the world. I was very surprised when I was in Timaru in South Island, New Zealand, to read in the Timaru Herald an account of Abdul Baha's latest talk in London. And of course, had it been, how did my faith come to New Zealand? The first person to become a Baha'i in New Zealand became a Baha'i without any Baha'i ever going near her. She received correspondence from London telling her of the Baha'i faith, and she joined it without ever meeting another Baha'i. Not at that stage, she did later. So that's how the Baha'i faith came to England. We had a centenary of it just before the end of the millennium in 1998, and we have more than 1 or 2 Baha'is here now. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for your history of the Baha'i faith and how it arrived from Iran, where the Shahs were, to Europe and America and Britain. A very interesting story of history. Now, a next speaker, after which we'll take a food break, is Sister Sidra Naeem. She's a secretary to our Havering Interfaith Forum and is a qualified teacher. History is one of her favourite subjects at school. She has a deep interest in Muslim history in Britain, particularly because she was born in England and is the Deputy Lord Lieutenant for the County of Essex. She has delivered talks on the history of Islam in Britain at university level. And now I'll welcome Sister Sidra. Thank you.
Okay, right. How my faith came to Britain, I am going to do the Islamic part. How did Islam come to Britain? And History of Islam in Britain is actually a lecture on my YouTube channel. I have done it at university level, and it's over an hour long. So I have simplified it, so it's going to be a lot less time today. Okay. Now, if we look at our religion, it came much later than Christianity and Judaism. So obviously it must have come later than to England as well. Okay? So that is the timeline of when Islam came, and obviously then it must have come to Britain later. Okay, so here is what we're going to focus on. Does anybody know what century Islam came to Britain in, approximately? Yes?
19th century?
No way. That is way,
I
way...
think about 16th, 17th century, I think, because when the East India Company came here,
Right, before that, well before that. Anybody else? Put your hands up. 8th century? 8th century is the correct answer, well done. Okay, it's actually 8th century. So if we look at this chart, okay, the red bit in 632 is where Islam came and spread just after Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passed away, which is Medina, Makkah, and the other part of Saudi Arabia, the red. Then it was in 661, under Uthman's reign, which is all the orange area, and that was all Arabia in those days. And then by 750 AD, if you look at the yellow, the bright yellow, not the green, then from there it spread into Europe, and it hit Spain and Morocco. And it's actually from the borders of Spain that the Moors then came into Britain first as merchants, okay? They came onto all the beach areas like Brighton, and I've got evidence in a minute. For some of you have got frowns on your faces. So they came to the seaside areas on their boats to sell spices, perfumes, gold, cloth, silk, okay? And we've got evidence because in the museums we have got English kings who actually copied some of the coins. Now if you look at that coin, it's actually got the Shahada on there, which is the first pillar of Islam. And that was actually copied from some of the coins, the dinars that were being exchanged at the ports, the seaports. Here are some more. So we've got a Christian dirham with Arabic inscriptions on there, and we've got 2 dinars dating right back, okay, which were found actually at Eastbourne in Sussex, and some were found in Brighton. Where did I get this information from? From the British Museum. I've been there, and yes, I've been taking photos while I'm there. So we know it's all authentic information, okay? Now, after that, in Baghdad, in Iraq, there was the big House of Wisdom, Bayt al-Hikmah. It's called a big library where all the scholars were all, they were all exchanging books and knowledge and inventions here in this massive library. Did you know it was Muslims actually who set up libraries and all of these universities? It was Muslims that set them all up. So it was from there then, later on, some of those merchants who were coming to Britain, they were exchanging inventions and exchanging books and things. So here are some of the inventions that came to Britain, okay? Now, a lot of the inventions that first came were to do with our religion. The compass, so we know which way to pray. Prayer mats, carpets, okay? Soap, because we invented soap on how we wash ourselves and things like that before prayer. So we've got astrolabe, you can just quickly have a look at tents, conservatories, carpets, crystal, hydropower, dam, steam distillation, clock. This is why it makes me really laugh when Muslims are late, because it was Muslims that invented clocks for timekeeping, for prayers, okay? Toothbrush and toothpaste, soap, plasters, medical equipment, loads and loads of it, the first hospital, everything. So they brought all these things over, and I have actually got 2 books here, which you can look at in the break. 1001 inventions were brought to Britain by Muslim merchants. They then went into Oxford and University. Did you know Arabic was actually then taught in Cambridge and Oxford University? And a lot of people like Bacon and things like that then copied a lot of those inventions. And they're actually, Muslim people are actually mentioned in those British books as well. Okay? The very first Quran came over to Britain, and it was then translated into English. So this is the very first attempt of the translation of the Quran, which was done by Christians in Britain. Okay, it's very interesting. And then there were other things that came over. So Geoffrey Chaucer was writing the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Now we've all heard of the Canterbury Tales. Did you know that the Canterbury Tales actually mentioned a Muslim doctor in there called Al-Razi? So we know already that Islam has come to Britain because of the Canterbury Tales. Okay, so this doctor, Dr. Razi, is mentioned in there and about him treating a patient as well. And then we're fast forwarding the timelines. I'm going all completely in order. People then did start reverting to Islam. So this person here, John Nelson, was one of the earliest known Englishmen who converted to Islam, who is actually mentioned in the voyage made to Tripoli by Thomas Saunders. And they mentioned that he turned Turk. In those days, the Ottoman Empire was really, really big, and people, the English, looked up to the Ottoman Empire. So when somebody became Muslim, they said they've turned Turk. Also in England, nobody was allowed to become another religion. You could actually get killed. So when someone became Muslim, they pretended they were Turkish. They pretended they were an Ottoman. So this man then started wearing a turban, which the Ottoman Empire wore, and nobody touched him then. That was the only way. Okay? Now, Queen Elizabeth I, she was actually a very clever queen, and after the, basically after all the Crusades, she built up really good links with the Ottoman Empire. And to sort of, you know, be on good terms. There was lots and lots of trade going on in England at the time with Muslims, and she wanted to make good ties with the Muslims. And Queen Elizabeth I asked the Ottoman Sultan for naval assistance against the Spanish Armada in 1588 as well. So there was a lot of good interfaith, if you like, going on there as well. And it was actually in Elizabeth the first time when she actually had the very first Muslim ambassador to the Queen. He was Moroccan. So there he is, Abdul Uhaid bin Masoud. He was a Moorish ambassador to the Queen in 1600. Amazing, isn't it? And did you know that he dressed really regal, and at that time turbans became the fashion in England. So he brought on some of the fashion of the Renaissance in England as well. People started, the rich people started wearing robes and turbans and the sword on the side. I've got a new uniform and I've been told I have to put a sword here on the side, but I said I didn't want to. But anyway, so Deputy Lieutenant uniform, there it is, it's there. That's how it was started actually in the Middle Ages, didn't it? That's when Deputy Lieutenant started. Right, so there's lots and lots of trade going on, and then all the Middle Eastern, you know, traders are coming and trading and earning all the money. So do you think Queen Elizabeth I, who was quite a clever queen, okay, would then think a little bit about starting her own companies? Yeah, she thought, well, why is all the trade and all our money going there? Why don't I start up a big trading company, use English people, and we can trade and get all the money in ourselves? So she was very clever. She actually set up the Venice Company, and the Turkey Company formed the Levant Company. This was an English chartered company formed in 1592, formed with the purpose of regulating English trade with Turkey and the Levant. Okay? And she put this man to be the top person. He was a London merchant, Francis Levet, but she actually dressed him up as a Turkish person, so everybody then thought he was Turkish, and the trade then carried on. And did you know 110 ships were importing rum, spices, cloth, cotton, wool, indigo, the indigo dye, tin, pewter, soda and ash. And Queen Elizabeth I approved its charter as part of her diplomacy with the Ottoman Empire. This trading company brought loads of money to Britain, so then she decided to set up another one. What was the next one she set up, which is world famous even now?
East India.
Good. East India Company was set up by her. A lot of people think that was Queen Victoria. It was actually
Yeah,
her.
she was on the...
It was her, Elizabeth I. The East India Company was founded at the end of the 16th century. Its royal charter, granted by Elizabeth I in 1600, gave it exclusive rights to trade to India and the Far East. the company built its own shipyard at Deptford. Okay? So obviously more Muslims are now going to come in, aren't they, through all of that trading, you know, with her company. And piracy increased on the sea because there were so many good things coming into Britain. So who knows who this is? Captain John Ward of Kent, based in Morocco. He converted to Islam and became Yusuf Rees. Does anybody know who this is?
He looks like Johnny Depp.
It is him! It's Jack Sparrow. Captain Jack Sparrow was Muslim, everybody. You can look him up on Wikipedia, he's on there. Okay, Yusuf Rees was his original name. I'm not lying, you're laughing, but honestly, I've looked this up. So Captain John Ward was obsessed with little birds during his time in Tunisia, so much that the locals would call him Jack Asfor, being Arabic for sparrow. So this is where the name Captain Jack Sparrow came. When he became Muslim, he was not allowed back in Britain, so Tunisia took him in. Okay, that's where he lived. Right, so lots and lots of books are coming to Britain. 1001 Nights is one of those books. Arabian Nights, have you ever heard of those?
Yes.
And Layla Majnun is the big book, the big lover's tale in there. What do you think that eventually became? One of Shakespeare's plays. Romeo and Juliet. Watch Layla Majnun, it's the same story, okay? But obviously it was, you know, covered up with names and things. And the Muslim Moors, they had a noticeable influence on the works of George Peele. The Battle of Alcazar, okay, featured a Moorish character. And William Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice is another one. So, you know, there is a Moorish Othello in there as well, featured a Moorish Othello as its title character. So lots and lots of Middle Eastern influence coming into Britain. This is actually a document from 1641 which shows all the different sects in Britain, in London. And if we look closely, there's Mohammedans. Mohammedans, that is the Muslims, okay? And obviously, Church of England was the main one, but it does say they had discovered 29 sects here in London, all of which except the first are devilish, basically, okay? Right, on the ships that were coming, there was a very famous man, he was one of the cooks. All the cooks were from Sylhet in Bangladesh, a lot of them, and from Bangor and Bangalore. And this man here, he opened the very first Indian restaurant in London. It was called the Hindustan Coffee House. And that, I've got all the references up there, so this is a university lecture, so I've got all the references up there. His portrait is up in Brighton. Does anybody know why that is? Why is he up in the Brighton Museum? For what reason? Any ideas? What did he do in Brighton?
Because maybe near the port, that's why maybe.
Nope, he opened up the very first baths. Okay? In those days, in Britain, people were bathing maybe once a year, things like that. You can look up all the history. And Muslims invented soap products. If you think of alkali, which is used to make soap, it's an Arabic word, al-ghali. Al-ghali is Arabic, okay? Al-ghali, alkali, okay? So he invented soap and he opened up the very first Indian way for baths in the beach in Brighton, okay? And all the Victorians and everything went there. Along then comes Queen Victoria. She ruled 3/4 of the world. And a lot of those countries were Islamic countries. She also drove the expansion then of the British Empire in Asia. Okay? So, and she became the Empress of India as well. So a lot of Muslims came then. One of the people who is prominent is William Henry Quilliam, who you might have all heard of. Yes? He built the first mosque. So he was a revert and he built the very first mosque. I'm now going to put up a BBC programme. So let's listen.
A century ago, Liverpool was a flourishing port, and Muslim sailors from India and the Far East would have been regular visitors. This rather faded terraced house in a Liverpool suburb is where this forgotten story of Islam begins. Although it doesn't look much now, in the 19th century, this was the first mosque in England. In 1889, the house was bought by a man named Abdullah Henry Quilliam. Quilliam was a Victorian gentleman, but he was also a Muslim convert, a religious innovator who fought to change preconceptions of Islam at a time when society found it frightening and alien. And it was here that he set about doing it. Against the odds, Quilliam established this not only as a mosque, but as a flourishing Muslim institute with its own printing press and an orphanage. It was the centre of Islam not just for Liverpool, but for the whole of Britain.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
It's an achievement that some Muslims believe holds the key to the future of British Islam. But it was a highly controversial decision. This public display of devotion to Islam immediately put him on a collision course with both the Christian hierarchy and the people of Liverpool.
Quilliam faced hostility right from the very beginning. They were attacked on a number of occasions. You get pigs' heads being thrown into the mosque.
They would congregate mobs outside the mosque who would start jeering. It raised hackles, there's no doubt about that.
In the face of such opposition, the mosque seemed to have an uneasy future. Quilliam's genius was to analyse why Victorians despised Islam and begin to address their prejudice. Quilliam knew that one of the key criticisms against Islam was that it was narrow-minded. It didn't embrace the new scientific discoveries of the 19th century. These lectures met such criticisms head-on.
So he's presenting Islam in a very rational way that's going to appeal, in a sense, to the new scientific consciousness of Victorian Britain.
These events drew converts, and as numbers grew, so did Quilliam's profile. It wasn't long before the mosque was attracting important guests from abroad. In 1897, Queen Victoria held celebrations for her Diamond Jubilee. One of the visitors was a general from the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, but he didn't just visit the Queen, he also made his way to Quilliam's mosque. It was recorded in the Crescent. Such visits impressed the locals and gave Muslims the sense of being an important part of city life. And in the mosque, as converts straddled the social divides and clerks rubbed shoulders with explorers, it seemed that Islam was no longer an alien faith practiced only by foreign sailors. Quilliam's high-profile guests, his lectures, and the type of converts they drew seemed to have achieved the impossible. Islam was starting to be integrated into British society. Within 20 years, but just as Quilliam was at the height of his success, everything changed. In June 1908, he and his eldest son left on what was supposed to be a 6-week trip to Istanbul. No one knows exactly why, but without any warning, they mysteriously disappeared.
After some months, his youngest son, who stays behind, begins to dismantle everything that Abdullah Quilliam had created. The properties are sold, and effectively the Liverpool Muslim community comes to an end.
With the disintegration of Quilliam's mosque, the outlook for Islam in Britain appeared uncertain.
Okay, there is good news though, later on. That was actually a BBC documentary, actually. The whole of that documentary is on my YouTube channel with the full lecture. which I did at university. Right, this is the Crescent newspaper, which we spoke about in there, with all the, you know, all the journals in there, the scientific journals. And it was actually at this time when Queen Victoria started bringing in lots of Muslims, and this man, Abdul Karim, is actually the Indian secretary to Queen Victoria. I don't know if anybody has seen Victoria and Abdul, the film. Who's seen that film? Yes? Brilliant film, because it shows about him and how close he was to Queen Victoria. He was actually, she liked him more than her own son. The son wanted to kill her because he wanted to become king. And he really looked after her really well. Okay, so it was actually then, later on, that he started going to a mosque in Woking. It was a very big purpose-built mosque that was built there. It's still there today. And it was, Woking Mosque was actually built for Indian students. Lots of Indian students were coming over because Queen Victoria reigned India, and for them to pray in. And it was in that mosque that there were 2 more reverts. I'm not going to put the video on for that one, but there is another video about those 2 reverts. But they also did lots and lots of interfaith activities to help integrate into the community. So, and they also copied the magazine from the other mosque in Liverpool and started publishing magazines. We've still got those today. In fact, I have put actually the website up there if anybody wants to read them. And one very important revert who actually went there to that mosque broke history because he translated the Quran authentically. Marmaduke Pickthorne, okay? And I have got his original Quran here. Look how old this is. This is the original cover, okay? That is Marmaduke Pickthorne's translation to the Quran. And even today, the most famous one we use is actually his. Even today. So he's gaining a lot of blessings, isn't he? Okay. We're fast forwarding, okay? We've gone past Victoria times. It is now the First World War, okay? And by 1913, the British Empire held sway over 412 million people, 23% of the world population at the time. Britain did not have enough soldiers. They needed help to fight in the First World War. So England then used the countries, the Islamic countries, which they owned, which include a lot of the Middle East as well, and India, and brought soldiers over to help fight with the British. So, yeah, we've got Sikh there as well, at the front. There were lots of Sikhs. Because did you know that the depot, the army depots, did you know, were in the Punjab area of Pakistan, and there were lots of Sikhs there as well. The partition had not happened yet. But I've got a quick video now, which I'm going to just put that on to explain it all. But what this video doesn't show is all the Middle Eastern countries. So did you know Algeria, Libya, all of those countries, soldiers, they're all Muslims came as well to help.
Britain declared war on Germany on August the 4th, 1914. In the first few weeks of the conflict, German forces quickly advanced through Belgium and France, wiping out large sections of the British army. Defences at the front became so thin that Britain had to quickly call in reinforcements from elsewhere. In September 1914, soldiers began to arrive from India, which is present-day India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. During the course of the war, a total of 1.5 million Indian soldiers came over and fought for Britain. Amongst these 1.5 million brave soldiers, there were over 400,000 Muslim soldiers, and at least 89,000 of these Muslims were recorded as having given their lives for Britain. It is a little-known fact that 20% of all British Empire recruits were actually Muslims. According to military historian Gordon Corrigan, if the Indian army hadn't arrived when it did, the Germans may well have broken through, and they may well have got to the Channel ports. and the whole history of the war may well have been very different. Some of these Muslim soldiers were awarded the highest military decoration, the Victoria Cross, awarded for valour in the face of the enemy.
We're going on now, moving forward to the Second World War. Again, Britain didn't have enough soldiers, so a lot of soldiers then were brought over again from the same regions, especially the Punjab area of India, and helped fight again, and some of them were women. Okay, now this lady, you may remember Rabbi Lee when I did the talk on the Holocaust, how Muslims helped in the Holocaust, and she was one of them. So a lot of people think it was all men, but did you know there were women as well? And she has actually, so Noor Inayat Khan was a British resistance agent in France in World War II. Why am I talking about her when we're talking about Britain though? Because her grave's in Britain, that's why she did come to Britain. So here is, in Gordon Square Gardens, Bloomsbury, London, is a memorial bust, and that's her George Cross that she won, which is a British award, and there is her memorial plaque, okay, as well. And Air Force's memorial at Runnymede, England, memorialising those without a known grave, okay. Right, after the war, England was war-torn, broken up. They needed cheap labour. What are we going to do now? Okay, let's get some more people from the Commonwealth countries that Britain owns. So adverts went out in all the Muslim countries. Come on down, everyone. Come and help us. We need you to help us rebuild Britain. So then the boats came over. Okay, some of them at the docks. This is a picture from the docks. And the British Empire, you know, comes into play to bring everybody here to help out with the war. And they were actually paid 6 times less, did you know, than British people in the war. And then in Pakistan, this is actually where a lot of the Pakistani ancestors came. In the 60s, there was a massive Mangla dam that was going to be built in the 60s, and they would have to displace 250 villages in the Mirpur district and displaced 100,000 people. More than half the residents of some villages had to move to Britain. So what happened was, you know, the forces, they were all there, the armed forces. So Britain said, right, why don't you come here? You helped us in the war, we'll help you now, we'll give you houses here. So then they came over, okay, in the 60s. Then what happened in the 70s in the African countries like Uganda? Come on, what happened?
President Amin.
Good. Idi Amin, he was another Hitler, that one was. He kicked a lot of Asians out of the country, get out, okay? And a lot of them were Muslim. And England was really good. They opened up their arms. They said, right, come on here. We'll give you the passports. You can come here. Okay? So a lot of those people then came here, and a lot of them were Muslim. Okay? A lot of them were Muslim. Fast forwarding now to the 80s, there was the Bosnian War. Do you remember the genocide that happened in Bosnia? And again, there were so many widows after that war. They had nowhere to go. They were kicked out of the country. And again, England then said, come on in here. So this is when the next influx of Muslims came. And I do actually remember this all of a sudden when they came. Okay, then we're looking at the EU. This is when we joined the EU. I know we've had Brexit since then, but when we joined the EU, a lot more than Muslims came from Eastern European countries into England. And then after that, we had the horrible wars, Afghanistan war, Syria war, Iraq war, Sudan war. More asylum seekers then came into Britain. Then after that, the government said, stop, no more. So they had to put a stop to it. So after that, it was stopped, and now it's, you know, keeping in limits. But England, is one of the countries where Islam is the second largest religion in the world. Okay? That's it. We're in present times now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation of their presenter. And my tummy is ready for food, so I hope everybody is ready. So we'll have, after the food break, we'll have 2 more speakers, our knowledgeable Latvia Boy Singh to come, and also Rabbi Lee from our local synagogue. So that's in part 2. Thank you. So we'll have a break now.
Yeah, cockpit jack, yeah, so that's not so bad. I mean, but you know, still good. Fair enough.
We started working with Overhead, which was a multiple denomination.
The air fryers, yeah, among some small ones.
And we needed someone, because the army acted as the day
about 6 months
in the week,
before
5 days a week, and provided them on Sunday.
They are quite good.
And we needed someone to be the coordinator to us churchmen, so you have to follow as a rabbi, you understand, you can't do the practical stuff.
Spring rolls have all gone, and the pizzas have all gone as well.
David would take on that role, and all I wanted to do, he never really wanted to be a church minister. And my wife is also a David. She
Right, biryani next.
and David was a incredible support. I can't speak hard.
Buns, did you have a bun? Buns are finished. Cheese buns.
I've sort of lost contact with him. He's on Facebook, and I write him to my wife. I seem to be working. I'm paid to pray for 60 years. And last week I did 80, and it was good for
It's cheap. On top of the frozen mashed pellets.
But I actually enjoy it.
Have you ever used those? Never. They're like little pellets about that long. It depends what make you get. But they're about that long and
It's
about
amazing. I mean, I've learned so
diameter.
much from
And
coming here and met so many amazing people.
I feel refreshed. I hope everybody's refreshed and energized. We come back to, not at the least, but the last 2 speakers to give us their takes about their faith's movement into this country. Okay, so next speaker up, Latvia Singh Boy from the Sikh community, is a Sikh representative on the Havering Interfaith Forum and a teacher in Punjabi.
Good evening, everybody. I'll start from EIC, which is East India Company, and Sidra already told it. Sidra's sister already told it was owned by Queen Elizabeth I, and it was started, I think, 1600 and dissolved in 1874. And mostly products it used to be imported from India, like silk, cotton, indigo, dye, sugar, salt, spices, tea, opium, and also slave labor. You know everybody, and they had headquarters. This is called headquarters, based in East India House in London. It's still there. If you want to see, you can go there, it's still there. And before I go my more talk, you can watch this video, which is created by one of my friends. He's a tourist guy, and then I will add a few things after that. Okay?
So Shepherd's Bush today is probably famous for its Westfield shopping centre, and over the years it's probably famous for its market, hustling bustling market on the west side of London, close to the BBC studios, but historically for Sikhs it's had a long association. So that area of London for Sikhs I think is of historical significance, especially for Sikhs outside of India. So when we say the Western Hemisphere, first Gurudwara in Europe, and then for the UK, so many stories, so many of our stories are woven in to that area. So for a little history of the Sikhs, we've developed a walking tour called our Holland Park Shepherd's Bush walking tour. And actually you can look at that west side of London, start at Kensal Rise and work your way through Notting Hill, get to Holland Park and explore Kensington and finish at the current Gurdwara at Shepherd's Bush. And you really go through nearly 150 years of Sikh history. So stop 8 is Kensal Green Cemetery. Now Kensal Green Cemetery is one of the great cemeteries in London. So when you go there, it's full of historic and important people. And it actually has a very strong link to Sikh history. Because Maharani Jind Kaur, she was the first Sikh to actually pass away in England. She was the mother of Maharaja Dalip Singh. In 1863, she passed away in Kensington. Now at that time, there were no arrangements for cremation. So Dalip Singh had to work with the government to fulfill her last rites according to Sikhism. So whilst that was happening, her body was laid to rest at the chapel of the dissenters in Kensal Green Cemetery. And so that's a strong link. And during that time that she laid in state, she had many visitors. And one of those visitors was actually Charles Dickens. You know, Charles Dickens came to pay his respects to the Maharani of Punjab, the great kingdom in India. So when you go there now, the Dissenters Chapel is still there, and outside there's now a memorial stone that says Maharani Jind Kaur laid here in rest. And you can see that, you know, you walk through, and that part of history and that story is told through this memorial plaque. So stop B, we head through Notting Hill, get to Holland Park, and that's the Kyoto Gardens in Holland Park, because really, that was a park that was on the doorstep of Maharani Jind and Maharaja Dalip Singh when they lived at Lancaster Gate. That was their local park. So for me, seeing the peacocks in the park and the Japanese gardens kind of brings that eastern part. Although the Japanese gardens are very 1980s, they came after, you know, a memorial later. It just shows that little connection to the east. So through those memorial gardens, we end up at 53 Holland Park. And 53 Holland Park was the London residence of Maharaja Dalip Singh. So when he was at Buckingham Palace or when he was engaging with the Queen, he would come from Thetford and stay here at his house and then take his horse and cart through to Buckingham Palace from Holland Park. So there's a memorial stone there, a blue plaque actually, an English heritage blue plaque saying Maharaja of Lahore lived here. Our next stop now, Tori, is at number 10 Sinclair Road, and it's at number 10 that lived Max Arthur Macauliffe. Now Max Arthur Macauliffe lived for a significant period of time, had Gyanis around him and translated the Guru Granth Sahib into English. It's the translation that many academics start with on their journey into Sikh studies. And Macauliffe then retired, moved to England, lived in Kensington at number 10 Sinclair Road. And Khan Singh Nabha actually came to visit him in London. There's photos of them together because they worked together in India on the translations. He came here, and most historians are sure that 79 Sinclair Road would have been facilitated by Max Arthur Macauliffe because it was 1908. He lives down the road. He's heard that a house has come up for sale. No one's really going to sell it to, you know, people from India of a different colour. So he facilitated the sale most likely, and that's why 79 Sinclair Road was the headquarters of the Khalsa Jatha from 1911. It's the first one. So 79 Sinclair Road is actually the first official Gurdwara in the UK and registered as Gurdwara. Prior to that, they were renting, the Sangha were renting a house in Putney, but because they were renting, the landlady didn't really want to say that they were renting to a group of Sikhs, so there's no official records, but they do know there was a house in Putney. But where the Khalsa Jatha British Shire was established in 1908, bought their first premises was here at 79 Sinclair Road. And when you see the old pictures, you see the house just as it looks today. But if you look carefully, you'll see a Nishan site above the front door. And that was the Gurdwara from 1911 to the 1950s. And I have those photos. And then now the flat looks exactly the same because it's listed. It's just minus the Nishan site. So if we look at the first time in 1908, we were renting a room in Putney. There was a small Sangha, students basically coming down from Cambridge, some at UCL, university students. And they knew that Maharaja Patiala was on a visit from Patiala to London. And they made an inquiry to meet with him at the Savoy Hotel because he used to use the Savoy Hotel in his UK embassy. He's from Patiala, so he would have a room and that would be all correspondence to the Maharaja would be care of the Savoy Hotel. So they went to meet him and said, look, we would like to set up a Gurdwara in the UK, a formal structure. And he agreed to it and he put up £8,000 donation. But then what happened, he, from his perspective, it would serve as his embassy when in the UK, so he became known as the Bhupinder Singh Dharamshala. So then all his correspondence in between visits to the UK would be to now Sinclair Road 79 rather than the Savoy Hotel. So over the years it grew and grew and grew. brewery. So for many visitors who came to London, they went to the Dharamshala, because that was their first stop before they organised themselves. So that brings us on to the current Khalsa British Isles, which is located at Queensdale Road. And that was Norland House, used to belong to one of these church groups, Norland House. And they just acquired that by raising funds during the 1950s. And they actually moved in 1969 to its current location. So prior to that, they were always at Sinclair Road, moved to their current location, which today is actually within walking distance of Shepherd's Bush, Westfield, the Westfield Shopping Centre. Basically, instead of going into Westfield, you cross over the lights, and literally within 100 metres is the current Khalsa British Isles Gurdwara. It's had refurbishments over the years, but its most recent refurbishment was to a very high standard. It has lots of weekly visitors because of its historic connections. And people, I think, don't really know the history around the streets, so they do ask, I think, in the Gurdwara. But we've now produced this electronic Google map, so if anyone asks, they can download it from the library at the Gurdwara and just walk around, go to Sinclair Road, go to Holland Park. If they want to walk as far as Kensal Green, they can do. Otherwise, they can get on the train and go back to central London.
As Ravinder Singh told us, the first Gurdwara was built in Shepherd's 1911. But he said also that no record ever said people was worshipping before that. As far I know from my uncle, he said there was people used to have a worship in their houses before 1911. As people came when the East India Company, on those times they came here, they settled here, like all Indian, Muslim, Pakistan and sorry, there was no Pakistan that time, like Muslim, Hindus and Sikh people came here, they settled here on that time, and they started prayers at home. And after that, they said, they used to hire a house, and they used to have a function there. And in 1911, they built a Gurdwara in 1911 in Shepherd's, London. He already told you in his video the first recorded Sikh settled in England dated in 1815 AD with the arrival of Maharaja Dalip Singh, last ruler of the Sikh Empire, the first Sikh place, the first Sikh palace worship, old Gurdwara. Despite the early arrival of the Maharaja, the first Sikh Gurdwara was opened in 1911 in London, and this was partly funded by the Maharaja Patiala, as he already told us in video. Prior to this, Sikh society called Khalsa Jatha was founded in 1908. In 2019, the statue of Sikh soldier was unveiled in the West Yorkshire to commemorate the Sikh martyrs in the World War I and World War II. This is the oldest Gurdwara, Shepherd Bush, which he's talking about. There's a renovation as well, and redecorate everything inside as well, refurbish everything. This is one of the biggest Gurdwara. The Guru Nanak Gurdwara is situated in the town of Gravesend, Kent. It is the largest Gurdwara in Europe and also one of the largest outside India. The complex has 3 prayer rooms and 2 large halls. There is a building used for Punjabi lessons nearby, called Punjabi School, and there is a day center for the elderly community. There is also sports hall hosting activities including boxing, basketball, and karate. The grounds are used for outdoor sports including football, and where the Gravesend Guru Nanak Football Club plays. This is the front elevation of the Gurdwara, and it's very big ground. I've been a few times over there, and actually they have big car parking. Actually they have also rented parking to the council, to park their car as well, because there's big land there as well. Represent Guru Nanak Football Club. The football club has female section where 70 women and girls play. The first inter teams in the FA People's Cup in 2019. In addition to Sikh players, they have Muslim, Irish, English, Asian and black players. The football club was started by the lady Param Gill, and in recognized UEFA rewarded her in 2018 with the UEFA Grass Sport Gold Award for her leadership quality. This was presented by UEFA President Alexandra Serafin at UEFA headquarters of Switzerland. There are throughout the over 260 Gurdwara across the UK. The majority of being adopted from the buildings with formal usage such as schools, churches, industrial buildings. Some of the listed buildings with the Sikh community supported and caring for these important historical places. In most of the Gurdwaras in these days serve 3 times food in the morning for breakfast, lunchtime and a dinner, and each Gurdwara at least I think serve about 300 to 400 people a day, and you imagine if it's over 260 Gurdwaras, then how many people really serve every day, people eat in the Gurdwara. And I was looking the Google, there's a few Gurdwara, there's one in Birmingham, there's quite big Gurdwara, and that serve about 2,000 people a day. And same as this Gurdwara, the Gurdwaras deliver hundreds of meals daily to the hospital every single day. They have brought lunch and dinner for the staff. Thank you very much to listen to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lecter. I would welcome the last but not the least, Rabbi Lee Sunderland from the synagogue. So welcome, Lee.
The history of the Jews of Britain is as much as the Jews' history in any sort of country in the world. The first sort of recorded Jews in this country are brought in from Rouen by William the Conqueror. And they are effectively used, much as the Commonwealth cousins were in the last century, to provide those jobs which the locals could not do. And one of them was, of course, usury. Nowadays we've got a nice fancy word for it, we call it finance. Effectively, the Bible says a Christian cannot lend a Christian money and charge interest. A Jew cannot lend money to a Jew and charge interest. But a Jew can lend money to a Gentile and charge interest. Yeah, nice basic Jewish Bible for you. And this is one of the things which actually cements what becomes of the first influx of Jews into this country. Because they are used as financiers. And they prosper quite nicely, in the 13th century anyway, because there is a great upturn in the economy, there's a demand for commerce, there's a demand for infrastructure, and the Jews are the ones who are providing the finance. And so in the end, they become overpowerful for their size, because they're the only ones that are providing the finance. They're therefore getting close to royalty and to the higher echelons of society, and people are getting jealous. And that jealousy breeds the anti-Semitism of old that we know going on ever since. So, the Crown are not daft, they take advantage of it all, and they start introducing additional taxes on Jews. To the extent that they create a government office called the Exchequer for the Jews. The Exchequer for the Jews is a modern day racist HMRC, because it has to record every transaction that an English Jew is involved in and go collect a tax from him. An additional tax over and above whatever other taxes are made. And kings in those days are using this money to finance their wars. But of course they get a bit too greedy, so you end up with a guy called the Aaron of Lincoln, who in the 12th century is supposedly the richest person in the country, far richer than the king is, and that breeds even more jealousy, and eventually things turn sour. Now, because the Jews are actually not living the wonderful picture that I've just painted. Life is not easy. They're actually effectively slaves of the king. They're only here because the monarchy lets them be here, but they're owned by the king, they can be bought and sold by the king. Whatever money they make goes to the king. So they're not actually having such a good time of it. But because they are so close to the higher powers in the country, your man in the street is jealous of them. And it starts to breed racism. And so the Tower of London plays a very important role in medieval Judaism. Because the Jews are effectively the property of the king, they have the right to go into royal property whenever they want. So when there's a pogrom going on and they're being massacred, they run into the Tower of London, close the doors, and they're safe. This is the kind of thing that they're having to put up with. But eventually, by the year 1290, things have got so bad that they're being putted out. There are pogroms going on, there are blood libels going on in places like London and Norwich and Northampton, major towns of the day, and they are expelled. Before that, though, they did live a very prosperous and thriving life, to the extent that we have in Judaism a branch of culture and custom which goes under the term English custom. Minhag Anglia. It's the English custom of how the Jews practice their religion in England. And the book is published, and it becomes an established creed within Judaism, distinct from the rest of the world. Nobody else behaves that way. So we have our own prayer book, we have our own customs, we have our own way of doing things, and it's a beautiful fusion of being English and being Jewish. We could do something like that nowadays. It'd be very wonderful. But that goes by the wayside, and the Jews are expelled in 1290. And it's not until the middle of the 1600s that they're coming back. And how they come back is quite fascinating. Absolutely fascinating altogether. And where they come from is equally fascinating. What you have in the middle 1600s is not a king, but Cromwell. And what is Cromwell? Above everything else, a deeply religious man. And he gets wind that there are tribes of Red Indians in North America who are descended from the 10 lost tribes of the Jews. And he thinks this is absolutely fascinating. Because to him, one of the prerequisites of the Messiah coming back is that there are Jews spread out all over the world, so that they can spread this word of God. And so we have a chap called Manasseh ben Israel, living in Amsterdam, who is quite a capitalistic chap, as well as being a financier and a printer. And he's also got this messianic idea. It's something which they don't want to admit, but they borrowed it from the Christians. And the coming of the Messiah has become a central part of Jewish culture. And much of the prayers, much of the customs that we practice are aimed at it. So Manasseh ben Israel turns round and he says, you want this Messiah to come, you know what? You need to have Jews living all over the world. Why don't you start letting some Jews back into England? And that way, you'll be doing your bit to bring the Messiah back. And back in they come. Now, the Jews that come into this country from Amsterdam have already been expelled from Spain and Portugal. So effectively, they are Spanish and Portuguese Sephardi Jews. They're not the typical Ashkenazi Jews like me. I'm a very weak foreigner. A very cheap invitation. In fact, not even an invitation. But this is a point that I want to build up to for these next few minutes. Because what the Jews from Amsterdam do is they bring to England their Spanish and Portuguese style of Judaism, which is again a unique style of Judaism. It's not quite Sephardi, it's a bit less Sephardi than Sephardis. So it's not African and it's not Middle Eastern, it's sort of West European. And they establish a synagogue in Bevis Marks in the centre of London, which is now our oldest existing synagogue. And they build the community. And again, they go into all the same sorts of businesses that were before, and they mix and they mingle with the Jews. Now, if you walk into Bevis Marks, you will literally, within 2 minutes, not know where you are. Because you're walking around and the people are dressed in grey and black striped trousers, black waistcoats, black jackets, black silk top hats. And they speak English like Sir Malcolm Ruffin with a tennis ball in his mouth. Absolutely crazy English. The minute they start to speak Hebrew, you can tell they're foreigners, they're Peruvians. They are from Spain and Portugal. And I'm talking about going in there last week, not 300 years ago. They still speak Hebrew like thick Peruvian Portuguese people. Their first language is not English. It's not even Hebrew. It's Ladino, which is the Spanish and Portuguese equivalent of Yiddish. It's ancient High Spanish, with a big spluttering of Portuguese in it, and some Hebrew words stuck in here and there as well. It's a total foreign language, and they speak it as if you would be in Spain. But when they speak English, one speaks proper English. And they have kept that custom going for the last 370 years. But, having established this place, we then, let's jump a couple of hundred years just to make it nice and quick, we'll jump to the late 19th century. And then we will start to find influxes of Jews from all over the place. And the first big influx is coming from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from Ukraine, from former Soviet Union countries, where the Bolsheviks are getting their hands in, and later than that the communists will get their hands in, and it is becoming absolutely impossible for Jews to survive in that place. The pogroms going on all the time. My family came over here from the Ukraine in 1896. Story has it that we thought this was America. But remember, this is the closest sort of English-speaking country away from mainland Europe. So you take him on a merry dance in a ship round the North Sea a couple of times, plonk them off in Portsmouth or Glasgow or Dover and tell them it's America and away you go. But it's the beginning of what I think is a very destructive period which we're now living in for Judaism. This is not the nicest part of Jewish history, because they bring with them their own cultures, their own way of doing things, their own customs, their own language. They don't speak like they don't know what it is. They're speaking Yiddish. And so many of them are coming over that they're actually starting to swallow up the indigenous Spanish-Portuguese population in the country. So they're taking over. So a lot of the Spanish and Portuguese customs are being lost. The ancient Minhagange from 300 years before that is totally forgotten. And we're now becoming more Russian and Polish. And it's causing a lot of friction, especially as the people that are coming over from Eastern Europe are peasants. And a lot of the people who have been here since the 1650s are established in commerce and in finance, and they are of the upper class. And the twain shall not meet. So you end up with these East European Jews moving into to the East End. And it happens not just in this city. Glasgow's East End is exactly the same as London's East End. And Liverpool's East End is the same again. That's where you end up with the poorer immigrant European Jews. And they thrive in their own world, and the British Jews thrive in their own world, and the twain never meets. Except that again, because of these immigrant waves, the original good, proper, decent Spanish and Portuguese English Jews are disintegrating. They're being completely lost. And all the customs that they've brought with them are being lost. But we've got this sort of thing happening now every single decade of the last century. Because in the First World War, again they're coming over from Eastern Europe, also from Hungary now. So you have an influx of Hasidic Jews coming in, who are different again from the Russians. In the 1930s, they're coming in from Germany, where they're very intellectual, very cultural, and again very, very different from the Russian peasant farmer. And we're getting this mix of Jews, which in one way is really lovely, because you can walk out the street and never know who's a Jew. But in another way, they're conflicting with each other all the time. They're not getting together. They're not bonding. They're at each other's throats, because one not dressed too much like them. They're British, the other lot are too dirty and they're not rich enough, and they're just never ever going to get together. Let's move again after the Second World War. We don't need to talk about that. It's an obvious one. And then we go to the 1950s. They're coming in from Hungary. And then in the latter decades, they start to come from the Middle East, where all these countries are starting to have revolutions, and there's struggle and strife all over the place. So we're getting Jews coming in from Yemen, from Syria, from Jordan, from Turkey, from Iran, from Iraq, from Libya, from Morocco, and they're all different. And they're all bringing their own blend of Judaism with them. But instead of turning around and learning from each other, they tell each other they don't know what they're doing. And they despise each other. And it's ridiculous. that's what we're ending up with now. With so many Jews in this country from so many different places. And they are all, in and of themselves, rather small communities. Remember, we've only got 250, maybe 300,000 Jews in this country at the very most. At the very most. Yet I haven't mentioned the Jews that have come over from Cochin, from the south of India. We have Jews that have come over from China, from Shanghai, where they ran at the beginning of the 19th century, and then after the Second World War, got out and came over here, and to other places as well. And then, of course, in the 70s, they're coming out of Russia, and then they're starting to come out of Africa. So we have the Ethiopian Jews, most of whom went to Israel, but some have come here. And we're beginning to discover as we travel around the Commonwealth that there are Jews absolutely everywhere. There are Jews in Jamaica. They've still got one of the only 3 synagogues in the world where there is sand on the floor and not carpets. They're everywhere. And it is because, effectively, they've been marginalised in trade. They've only been allowed to trade in certain areas. Mostly, they're either dangerous or financially very iffy. So the Silk Road from China to India is full of Jews. Who else are you going to send out on a boat from Bombay to Peking? Let them spend 9 months trying to do that and see if they can come back alive. And this is where that whole idea of taking the Jews and making them the victims of their own success has come from. And where we've got to ourselves today is this little mixture of Jews from absolutely all over the place. But they're all different. They've all got their own established customs. They've all got their own languages, their own clothes, their own food. Because by and large, they're not, over the centuries, wealthy enough to import all the foods they need from Israel. It just doesn't happen. It just couldn't happen. It didn't exist. So you had to put up with what was there. So you have to find an English way of making Jewish food. And a French way, and a German way, and an Italian way. And that's how we have, to an extent, got a lovely, vast culinary culture. Because we've had to adapt to what's there. So we're all doing things extremely differently. What's happening today is that there seems to be a strength within the Lithuanian and Polish and Hungarian communities. These seem to be the strongest ones. And one of the things which they've brought with them is the idea of making sure they have enormous families. So they are literally outnumbering everybody else. But with numbers comes weight and strength. But what they're now doing is they are impacting their customs, their way of doing things, onto everybody else. And the 90% of Jews that don't know their Jewish history are swallowing it up. They're gullibly swallowing it up. They're taking on the fact that, the way they've been doing things is wrong. And they've got to do it the other way. So we're losing a lot of our culture, and we're losing a lot of our custom, out of pure ignorance. And so the Jew that lives in this country today is a vastly different one that lived here 300, 200, 100, and even 50 years ago. And the only thing that we've got on our side is printing. Because when printing was invented in Italy, there was a boom in education throughout the whole world. And And Jews, more than anyone else, gained from it because they were able to then start printing all the responses and all the letters and all the manuscripts that had been written, and they're able to disseminate them. And in modern world Jewry, there is this great thing now called an English translation of just about everything. And so there's a good lot of books around the world. But what we've got, unfortunately, is more folklore and ancient custom than practiced custom. So the movement of peoples around the world is not always to our advantage. It can be to a great disadvantage. And I'll end on a sad note because it's one that I always preach. And that is that we are still suffering from the Holocaust. Because the attitudes that many of our older people have been left with, which they've passed on to the next generation and to the next generation after that, means that we are entirely we are destroying ourselves. Because we're changing our names. Lee Sunderland sounds like a Jew, I don't think. Doesn't sound like one either, but that's another problem. We're not using our names, we're not speaking our language, we're not wearing our clothes, we're not eating our food. We're not keeping our customs, we're not keeping our festivals. We're trying to integrate and be as British as possible. But worse than that, we're trying to be as Jewish as little as possible. And that's because, for us, the Holocaust is still alive. All the time that there are people who were born in the camps, the Holocaust is still alive. And we're still reeling from it. And there are people in their 70s who were born in the camps, who have now got grandchildren who've got the same attitudes that they've got. You don't tell anyone you're Jewish. You don't admit it, you don't show it, you don't display it. If you're unfortunate enough to need plastic surgery, so you hide your face. You pretend. But that's what's happened to us. So this journey, this great journey of Jews around the world, is actually, in a sense, a very, very destructive one. But here we suffer from a chronic lack of numbers. If you go to places like America, it thrives. I mean, New York's got as many Jews as Israel's got. And it thrives. But again, it's only those few communities from Eastern Europe that are the ones that are thriving and taking over. And everything else is being lost. And this is where we're at the minute. So we ended up here, thanks to pogroms, thanks to people needing our business news. And what we're doing now is almost disintegrating.
Thank you very much, Lee. And being the last, and not least of our presenters. Yes, and we're going to move on to the Q&A after a fast whirlwind of the history of Jewish people in and out of Britain. So may the speakers please sit in the front, please. Let's start the questions. Yes, the first hand up is over there. Is Naeem.
Okay. When all the faiths established themselves first in this country, when they gained followers, like in terms of converts and immigrants that came from different countries, okay, is it correct they didn't have a good quality? Like in terms of the British society, they didn't accept, the British society then in their days didn't accept, different faiths from different communities. In terms, there were no interfaith marriages. Basically, there was a lot of racism. In terms of job opportunities, people actually couldn't progress. Now, as nowadays, there's a lot of tolerance. So is that the way it was when people from different faiths, first established themselves in this country? Is that what they faced then?
Sentence, yes. But you're missing a very important point. All this idea of not marrying each other, blah, 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 is not racism. It's self-preservation. We're trying to build our own communities. You can't build your own community when you're diluting it. So if you want to build a community, stick in the community.
Short and sharp. John?
Well, as I say, the first Baha'is became Baha'is here without any missionaries from anywhere else coming here. So I mean, they kept as much British culture as you can, as was relevant. But then, of course, the difference there is that, of course, you have the Persian Baha'is coming over. And the Persian Baha'is have various customs themselves. So you've got, effectively in the Baha'i faith, you've got two cultures coexisting happily side by side, with Persian culture and the English culture. But you don't use your culture if you become a Baha'i. The fact that the Baha'i scriptures have been translated into over 800 languages tells you that the whole idea is that it pertains to all cultures. There is no actual culture that is, what do we say, no actual dominant culture. The only proviso for a Baha'i marriage is that the couple choose each other and then the parents give their consent. There's nothing about interfaith remarriage or anything like that. It's just the couple chooses.
I think maybe you can say this because as far I know, it's happened to me a few times. And I think when I came in 1976, even before people came, they have very difficulty to set in the English community. Because I went to one job, they asked me to take a Taranol. I said, no, I'm not taking Taranol, this is part of my religion. And slowly, we built our own community. Now we see Sikhs are quite high position in every field. Now it's no restriction anywhere, you know. People wear turbans, and I remember in the railways, the first Sikh, 1964, they allowed him to wear the turban. And a lot of in the post office people, they have to cut their hair to get the jobs on those days, in the early 1950s. They was racist, I would say. Thank you very much.
Okay, with Islam, I think everybody knows there was definite discrimination when everybody came, but things have definitely changed. I think where I see the most discrimination was actually in jobs. So I've got my own family's experience. My mum was actually a head teacher abroad, and when she came here, she could not get a job as a teacher. So she ended up doing other things, you know. And my dad as well, he was highly educated. He actually did his master's in this country from a university here, Bradford University, but still he couldn't, you know, it was difficult to get a job. So discrimination was definitely there, but I think things have definitely changed. I mean, with the new generations, I can definitely see people in very high positions. You know, I mean, now I go to very big dignitary events. You know, some of you who know me, and there are so many mayors and I'm a deputy lieutenant and I'm a Muslim, so there's no problem at all now with the new generations, and also there's laws in place. So this faith hate crime is a law, you know, under the Police Act, and you can actually get arrested for, you know, faith hate crime as well as race hate crimes. So slowly over the years, things have definitely changed, and for the better. And I think what's happening now is the new generations who are being brought up here, really think themselves as British. They're not going to take anything else because they think, well, we're just like you. We're born here, we went to school here, we were educated here. Why would we take anything less? So for the better, really. Even interviews, you know, you can sue people nowadays, can't you, if you feel you're being discriminated. Things can still happen under the table and things like that, but I think on the whole, from what I've seen, things are definitely better, and I think we need to move on as well. I think there's no point in talking about the past. This happened to our grandparents and this happened to this. Let's look at now. Let's think of things positively. look on the positive side. Look how much we've progressed, and look how well everything's going now. You know. So that's all I wanted to say there.
Could I just say something around that? It's one of the reasons why the corner shops sprang up all over the UK is because the immigrants couldn't get jobs, so they worked for themselves.
Yeah.
And factories and, you know, all these, they made their own garments and sell it because they couldn't get jobs with other people, so they created their own.
Yes. One thing else I wanted to mention, because it was very interesting what Rabbi Lee was saying about all the different influxes of different types of Jews, and then it all changes with everyone. That is actually one thing in Islam which stays the same. So when you look at the actual religion, it doesn't change, no matter which country you're from. There's still the same Quran, and it's because the Quran is in black and white, it doesn't change, and also the 5 pillars, everything intact. So you can go anywhere in the world, anywhere you like. The language may be different, the colour of the people may be different, what they're wearing may be different, their culture may be different, but the religion is exactly the same. And that's one thing that struck me when I went to do pilgrimage the most, was there were people there, millions from all over the world, all different colours, cultures, everything different, but the religion was exactly the same. Everybody doing exactly the same thing. So that is one beauty, definitely. Yeah.
I have a question on what about what you just said.
Yes.
From your lecture, what you said, religion, Islam was very new in the country, and the number has grown. The number of Muslims, obviously, with religious tolerance and the laws that we have, the Islamic faith has grown in this country. Would you say the same is true for the other faiths, for the Jewish, Sikh, and Vatican faiths? Would you say the numbers
have they grown? You mean?
Yeah, in terms of the trend, is it the same or? For the number of Jews have gone down.
We've shrunk. We're shrinking very, very, very badly. For example, I grew up in Glasgow in the 1970s. There were 11,500 Jews in Glasgow. And people were complaining how the community had shrunk because previous to that there had been 18,500. Today, you're lucky to have 3,000. And all the provincial communities are doing exactly the same thing. And we suffer from 3 basic things. I dare say it, interfaith marriage, whereby we will lose people. People not getting married at all, so just not coming and bothering to be part of the community in the first place. And the size of families has gone down to an average of 2.1. Now, my mum's sister married a guy who had 11 brothers and sisters. And at that time, it's nothing unusual. So part of the thing that I was mentioning before, I didn't probably make it clear enough, is that the reason why we're being smothered now by these East European, the Jews originally from Eastern Europe, is because in places like Stamford Hill, massive families. You have 6 kids, people want to know why you've not had any more yet. Comes to Romford. The biggest family I've seen in Romford is 5 kids. And that was 75 years ago. That's why we're losing so many. We are hemorrhaging at such a speed that it's likely that the normal Jews like me are not going to exist in 50 years. You'll either be ultra-Orthodox or you'll be Reformed. Nothing left in the middle. And we're shrinking and shrinking and shrinking all the time. And that's, to answer your question, my darling, why we need to strengthen our own faith and keep it to itself, because if we don't, it's going to disappear. And over the last 70 years, we've proved it can disappear very rapidly.
Yes, it is increasing every day, because if you look now, it is in the 1950s that you hardly see any turban man. Now you go everywhere, you can see the turban man. And looking on the data, in each state, each city, Wolverhampton, Birmingham, Leicester, and London, they always increase in quite a lot. And maybe nearly 2%, I think, in this overall population in this country. Sikhs are nearly 2%, according to the Google. and I think it's increasing every day, and that's it. And lots of actually my own family's relation, they married to different religion, and their children become Sikh. It's my own relative, lot of them. Even recently, my wife's nephew met because he couldn't find a Sikh girl properly, and he went to Gujarati girl. And a lot of I know our relatives, they said a lot of them married to different religion, and their children becoming Sikh now. The Sikh is increasing every day. And one day they said it will be Khalistan in India, and because the Sikh is increasing, one day it will be Raj of Khalsa, like we had Raj before Maharaja Ranjit Singh, they call Khalsa Raj. One day, Khalsa Raj will become again in India because of now Sikh is increasing. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
It's quite simple and follows on from what you've already shared. Most faiths have experienced quite a lot of challenge with the pandemic. How has it affected each of them, particularly numbers of devotees in worship?
I'll start with that, because I've done talks on this before.
You probably talked for a lot, I'm afraid.
Right, so how did it affect Islam, the pandemic, yes? So first of all, it definitely did affect our mosques, and we were praying at home because a lot of our prayers are in congregation, and we couldn't pray in congregation, and even our Eid prayer, I remember in the pandemic, in lockdown, we had to do at home. So the community is the mosque, basically. The mosque is the community, and it did affect that a lot, our social life. So that's the first thing. The other thing was Islamophobia actually rose during COVID because there was this thing about Muslims are not taking the vaccine. There was all these conspiracy theories going around, and also we're spreading it more because the BAME community got the virus the most. The reason was because of lack of vitamin D, and because of lack of vitamin D, because of our skin colours and things, our immunity is low. And so we got the viruses more. And also things like diabetes is rife amongst our communities, and heart disease and things like that. Again, that means our immunity is low, and then the Muslims caught COVID quite a lot. And then we were tarnished by it, that, they're spreading it more. They live in huge families, they're spreading it more, things like that. So there was all of that going on as well. So it affected us in two ways. There is actually a talk on my YouTube channel if you want to watch on this subject.
Yes, this is affecting the Sikh community as well. I know we have closed our Gurdwara for a few months, and then we follow the rules of regulation of the government. We had, when everybody comes to the Gurdwara, we check the temperature, everything, we have proper machines inside installed. When you come in, you check the temperature and everything, and we follow the 2-meter distance, and we in the main prayer hall, people are sitting every 2 meters away from each other, and even if it's more than coming, we ask them to stop outside, and even our langar hall, which is a dinner hall, we don't have less than more than 20 people in there, and it affects actually. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We actually had a slight increase in people after COVID, strangely enough. During COVID, our chapels were shut all over the world, where the government had said we need to be socially distanced and isolated and everything. And we held meetings by Zoom. Every chapel is very similar to this, and every service runs along exactly the same lines, so there's nothing different. And the interesting thing is that in the year preceding the pandemic, the prophet of our church had actually told us that we were going to now be more Christ-centred, studying at home and supported at church. And he didn't know that a pandemic was going to happen, but he felt inspired to tell us that we needed to study at home, study our scriptures at home, with our families or individually, so that we could be spiritually prepared. And we didn't know why, but then all the pandemic happened the next year, and we were prepared then to be able to study together at home. We had Zoom meetings where people were giving talks on Zoom and presentations on Zoom, and Sunday school lessons and discussions about the scriptures and things like that. So we were able to kind of keep together as a community, and our missionaries, where before they would have been out and about in the town centre meeting people, they didn't do that any longer, of course, so they were able to kind of make more social media contacts and things like that. So they met more people over the internet things and people that had been interested in the church beforehand. And so they came on board with the Zoom, and some people that were perhaps less able to get out, that were more sort of had more mobility problems, they tended to stay home once we all came back to the chapel, and we had the same as in Latvia, very strict restrictions about where you could sit, and temperatures being taken and everything, and lots of things like that to be put in place, masks being worn for a long while. But we actually found that we've actually had an increase in our numbers. I mean, one thing that I forgot to mention in my presentation, probably along with about half a dozen other things, is that for a long time it seemed that there were more members in America than out of America, but the situation long surpassed that long ago. There are much more members outside the church than outside of America than inside America now, North America. So we've found that our congregation, we have lost some people that are a little bit elderly, that found it more comfortable to continue with Zoom, but we have gained quite a few new members actually. So and our church is growing all the time in England, so or in Great Britain, so we're really pleased with that.
The real change was that we started to meet on Zoom and instead of in person, and that meant that suddenly we had Baha'is from New Zealand joining in with our meetings, which was very nice. And see Baha'is from different parts of the world that we don't usually see, because we know very well. So that's the main difference. But otherwise, it's a kind of status quo.
I'll come back to the person, David, to ask the question.
Yeah, thank you. From what I've heard this evening, with most of your faiths, they've come to the UK through immigration and migration and so on. And to the uneducated viewer, it might seem that those faiths have remained quite monoculture. Could you share a little bit, or just explain how your faith is, or are native British people joining your faiths, or are they remaining very much of the particular culture from where they came? It's probably the best way to phrase that one.
I think that's a very, very interesting question, and I can tell you actually my own experience. Obviously, when I was growing up, it was very multicultural, and I would say where I grew up in London, 50%, I would say at least, were white British English, and the others were from a different background. And in the days when my parents came, we mixed with the white British community because there was not enough of our own to mix with. Yes, so we had to. And in a way, that was good because everybody was getting along with everybody else. I mean, I used to have English next door neighbours around my house, and I've got pictures of myself in, you know, Auntie Dorothy's lap and things like that, because we had to mix, okay? But over the years, in the same area where my parents still live now, the new generations that come over, they have got enough of their own, who speak their own language and are of the same religion and are of the same culture. So they feel, well, why do we need to mix? We don't need to. Why do we need to put ourselves out and lower our confidence and try and speak English when we can just speak our own language with our own people? So what I'm finding now in London is everybody's in their own little groups. So the Bengalis are together and the Pakistanis are together and the Indians are together. And that's the problem we get when there's too many, I say, of one kind. But the same also happens within the white British culture. So if you look at where I worked in Brentwood, Doddinghurst, I can give you the village name, it was all white British English. And they didn't really want to mix with anybody else because they had enough of their own. Why do they need to, you see? So that's the problem, I feel, personally. And I know it's the same in Jewish, like Stansted Hill, isn't it? That's the only reason why they are the way they stick together, because why do they need to mix with anybody else? Why put themselves out, you see? So I think this is the same in all areas, but on the whole we should keep it mixed. Like Romford is a good example, actually. It's nicely mixed at the moment, isn't it? But places like London, I would say people are not integrating, definitely not. I know many Bengalis in East London, Whitechapel, who can't speak English. The ladies, I know many that can't speak English. They don't need to. Why do we need to learn English when we've got enough of our own to speak to, you see? So very interesting, but on the whole, my own personal view is I feel no area should be completely of one culture and one colour and one faith. It should be a good mix, and that's the only way you're going to get the integration going, really. But I really like that question.
Chairman.
I think everyone's fine to get to the microphone.
I was remembering when we had meetings in Waltham Forest, and I looked round the room and I thought, I was born in England, my wife was born in New Zealand, the lady there was born in Ireland, this lady came from India, and this lady came from Uganda. And we didn't even notice really, because we were all together. So we don't have the thing with the Baha'i faith, we have sort of people of one group. You do have it some with the older Persians, but the younger Persians all speak English and all argue about whether West Ham is better than Liverpool. So it doesn't really apply, it doesn't really affect the Baha'i faith.
It affects us terribly. And we have two sections in the Jewish community. There's one section that will not mix with anyone else so that they remain who they are and what they are. They'll wear their own clothes, use the same names, use the same language. You know, we are the biggest idiots in the world. We should be running the Foreign Office. Every person I know in Stanford Hill is a polyglot. They speak at least 4 languages, but they'll only use one, Yiddish. Then we have another section of society who, whatever they can do to not be Jewish, they will do. Because in Germany, in Eastern Europe, when you stuck out as being Jewish, bang. Or worse. And so the one thing they will fight to do is not be Jewish.
You mean they hide it?
Totally. Totally hide it. So we changed our names, our languages, our clothes, our food. Don't keep festivals. Don't do anything. Turn up to synagogue once a year just for the sake of it. Except they want to come to me to get buried in a Jewish cemetery. They want to live like a Gentile all their lives and get buried in a Jewish cemetery. I don't get a job out of it. But that is the serious problem that we've got. And we've had it certainly since the Second World War. If not since the pogroms at the beginning of the last century. The end of the previous century. That's our problem. But the only way that we can actually survive is to be ourselves. Because you can't put a Jewish shop where there are 10 Jews living. You've got 1,000 Jews who put a shop.
They probably hide it because they're afraid of the stigma.
They're terrified. Not just the stigma, they have an automatic attitude that Gentiles hate Jews. You might pretend that you don't, but you do. The darker your skin, the more you hate us. We'll do that another time.
I'm proud to be what I am.
Oh, there's one.
One minute question.
I was going to ask the question to Mrs. Naeem. The question is aimed for Mrs. Naeem. There are a lot of problems in society today. There's a lot of crime. There's not people don't have any highly moralistic values in society, and there's a lot of atheism. Okay, given the fact what different faiths have experienced in the past. Okay, because of these problems, it is, I mean, especially Islam and the other faiths, is that what is attracting a lot of people towards faith today, that need to believe in something because they've tried in British society, perhaps from a different faith, or perhaps, you know, they were atheists and whatever problems they have, is turning towards God now, basically, in Islam or any other different faith? Is that what's bringing them peace and harmony in their life or something like that? Or?
Yeah, well, with Islam, I think we believe that, you know, there's a quote in the Quran, verily in the remembrance of God do hearts find rest. So that is very, you know, proven fact, really, for us anyway, that, you know, believing in God gives you a sense of belonging, and prayer helps you, doesn't it, with mental health and things like that. So in Islam, definitely, we would try and, you know, associate ourselves with God and pray and things like that, if that's what it is that you're asking. I'm not really sure what the question is, to be honest.
The question basically was, how can I put it? People nowadays, there are, for example, there are problems that has in society, okay? So, for example, you know, Rabbi Sandal was saying that, you know, like, people don't have any highly moralistic values in society, they don't believe in marriage, okay? Or they don't believe in anything, they're alcoholics and so on. So, choosing a faith like Islam, okay, bring them, you know, religion gives them basically values, it tells them what to do.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So is that what people need? People need to be told what to do by religion, and so they have values in their life, so they stop going back behaving the way they used to in the past. Alcoholic, drugs.
Yes. Well, if they follow it, yes, definitely. It's all there, the morals are there. The Quran has a whole way of life, and it's all written in there, the rules and everything for a happy life. But it's a matter of if we follow it, isn't it? If we follow it, we'll find peace and things. It's like that with all religions, really, isn't it? Yes. Okay.
I'll answer you very simply, very quickly. Look what's happening to Prince Andrew.
Yeah.
Let me take you back 20 odd years. I love the man to bits, he's lovely. When King Charles was Prince of Wales, he turned round to Diana and said, "Do you expect me to be the first Prince of Wales ever to not have had a mistress?" Look how the world has changed. Look at the morality that's building up in the world. Our problem in the world at the moment is trying to give all the little groups their rights. So you have problems where trans people are not letting women get their rights. And that's what the fight is. We're becoming a very moral society without even realizing it. Because we do not like rape anymore, we don't like mistreating kids anymore, we don't like vandalism anymore, we don't like people being promiscuous anymore. All the things that 30 years ago we would laugh at. Now, Harvey Weinstein's in jail, Prince Andrew's goodbye. How many other people do you know are losing their jobs all the time? Top policemen losing their jobs because they smack somebody on the backside. Or they say something that they shouldn't be saying. When 20 years ago we'd be going, 6 and stones, make your bones, go back to work. We're becoming a very, very strong moral society without appreciating that there can be a religion that goes with it. And perhaps we need to realise that we don't even need a religion to go with it. Because that way, we can get all the other atheists to come and join us and at least all be moral. And if we can all be moral.
That's when religion becomes more important.
Not necessarily more important. There's another question for another time. Do we need to have a God, or do we need to have a book of morals? I would suggest to you that in a society where the vast majority of people don't believe in God, don't worry about it. Get your morals out and treat people properly. Then we will start to recognise that because we have different faiths, just like we have different sexual orientations, we've got to respect each other.
More questions?
I say a huge thank you to all the speakers. That's been quite illuminating.
Yes, thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attendance. It's been very fruitful discussion. Next discussion meeting will be, how does my faith promote the role of women or women? Date is 8th of March.
And it is International Women's Day.
And
And there will be all female speakers.
Oh, wow.
Penny will be the Jewish speaker. Penny will be the Christian speaker. I will be the Muslim speaker.
I'll go in hiding.
What's the subject?
And yeah, so you didn't mention it's International Women's Day,
International Women's Day, very
8th March.
important.
And all over the world, people are actually celebrating women.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why we're going to talk about women
Thank you very
that
much.
day.
Have a female MC.